On this episode of Newt's World, there is so much happening in our country right now, and many of you have questions. As part of my Inner Circle Club, I hold regular video meetings where you can ask your questions. Today, I met with my Inner Circle, and there were so many great questions that are so timely for what's going on right now that I thought it was the best way to share with you what I'm thinking about as I watch a really remarkably chaotic period in America. I hope you will find it informative. You can join my Inner Circle at newtsinnercircle.com. Well, it's great to be here, and this is my first Inner Circle from home. We got here last week, and so I'm delighted to have a chance to chat with you and to share what's going on. As Callista and I sort of try to get reoriented, it's very different, as you can imagine, from life in Rome. I thought I would start today by focusing on the first week of the Biden presidency, because I think it communicates a kind of very deep split between the message they would like us to get and the reality of what they're doing. I thought that the inaugural address, which Callista and I actually watched flying back across the Atlantic, I thought it was a good address. It had hit most of the right themes. A little bit of it was borrowed from Bill Clinton, but overall it was still, I think, fine. However, the challenge was Biden wanted to communicate unity and being together, being on the same side. But he promptly walked up to the White House from the Capitol and signed a whole series of executive orders which guaranteed disunity. Everything from, in effect, eliminating girls' sports by allowing males to participate in female sports, to deciding that he would suspend deportation for the next 100 days of illegal immigrants who had criminal records or criminal backgrounds, guaranteeing about something like 45,000 criminals will stay in the U.S. And this is, by the way, at a time when it was just announced we had the highest increase in murders last year in our major cities in American history. I think a 38% jump in the number of people killed in our big cities. He killed the XL pipeline. On all fairness, he had campaigned on killing the XL pipeline as part of his commitment to a green agenda. But it was interesting because, the union, which lost 14,000 jobs, had endorsed Biden. And yet Biden had publicly indicated all through the campaign that he would kill it. You go down item by item, and it's fascinating. In fact, I was on Sean Hannity, and a member of the union who had just lost his job was on, and he said he didn't have to fight with his union, but his guess was that 90% of his fellow union members voted for Trump because they just didn't believe the union leadership. So you have this consistent effort by Biden to create a much more liberal world. He had promptly abolished the 1776 Commission. Now, to give an example of sort of cultural politics and cultural warfare, the 1776 Commission was created by President Trump as an answer to the New York Times 1619 Project. As you know, in the New York Times Project, it's all based around the idea that the arrival of the first slave in 1619 is the real beginning of America, and that America can only be understood through slavery and through segregation. So the Trump administration, which thinks that actually American history is vastly bigger than that, to judge Washington or Jefferson or any of the founding fathers in a narrow 2021 way as compared to understanding them in the world they were in is a huge mistake. And to think that in America, which had fought a civil war to abolish slavery, and in which Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, was in any way dominated or defined by slavery, is just factually wrong. Well, I thought it was fascinating that on the very first day, the left culturally understood how big a threat the 1776 Commission was. And as a result, the left got Biden to kill it with an executive order the very first day. So I think that it's an interesting gap here. You have consistent executive orders towards the left. You have appointments to the cabinet, which in all fairness range from moderate liberals to very radical. You really have, I think, a serious challenge in dealing with people below the cabinet. In other words, you might have a secretary of a department who's sort of okay, but the 22 people appointed under that secretary are all left-wingers. And so you're going to see just an enormous range of regulations and decisions and funding that are all determined to be on the left. If Biden really wanted unity, which I don't think he does, I think Biden wants surrender and conformity, not unity. I think the fact is that we're in a situation where Biden, if he wanted unity, would call on the Senate to drop the whole idea of impeaching President Trump. Now, he's not going to do that. In fact, he said he thinks it's perfectly fine to go ahead with it. This is, I think, irrational. And this is all in the very first week, remember. It tells you that the one unifying element of the Democratic Party is the hatred of Trump. And as long as they can keep Trump as an issue, they can keep their members relatively happy because they think of Trump as a piñata. They're beating the piñata with their sticks so they can get at the goodies that are inside. And as long as the piñata survives, everybody at the party is really happy because they're beating the piñata. And once the piñata disappears, they're all going to be staring at each other, still holding sticks, by the way. And now they're going to go back to fighting each other. So in a sense, the longer they can keep Trump as a central issue, the better off it is for the Democrats. In addition, to some extent, it splits the Republicans. There is a branch of the Republican Party which always wants to be liked by the news media and always wants to be liked by the Democrats. It's not a very big branch. In the House, it turned out to be about 10 out of over 200. And so the vote was, I think, 190 against impeachment and 10 in favor. That gives you some idea of how big the difference is. But I think that nonetheless, it does split the Republican Party a little bit. It also keeps Trump focused on Trump, which is a huge mistake. What we don't need is to spend 2 or 3 years focused on Trump as opposed to solving problems. And I think the Republican Party will be better off. Trump should be challenged to join in the development of solutions to America's great problems, not just engaged in personality politics. So all of this is sort of the first week. I think from the standpoint of the country, it's very interesting that while all this is going on in Washington, the dictator of China, Xi Jinping, is off at Davos with all the billionaires being wildly received because, after all, he's mature and he's a statesman. And he doesn't have a messy political system like we do, largely, of course, because he has a secret police and they tend to lock people up. But it was very telling to me that Xi Jinping is getting all sorts of accolades as a wise statesman. The Europeans are swooning over him. The billionaires like him for 2 reasons. He makes them a lot of money, and they're all oligarchs. They all live in enclaves. They're all surrounded by security. The only people near them are people who say, yes, sir, and no, sir, yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. So they don't see any great problem. That's why you end up with companies like Nike and Apple and others lobbying against legislation that would prohibit the use of slave labor. These folks are all people who, in fact, want to have some kind of involvement. They want to make the money, and they don't want to think too deeply about how the money's getting made. And that's a real problem. So in a sense, this has been a good week for China. Killing the XL pipeline actually means the Canadians will probably send their oil to China. They've said this all along. And it's one of the reasons that when Trump decided to approve the XL pipeline, there was actually both a piece towards energy independence and towards job creation, but there was also a piece towards isolating China. Well, the Canadians aren't stupid. If the United States doesn't want their oil, they're going to build the pipeline across the Rockies to Pacific and send it to China, where the Chinese will be quite happy to buy it. The Chinese gained ground when the United States rejoined the World Health Organization, an organization totally dominated by the Chinese, which has done a terrible job with COVID-19, which is a Chinese virus. When Biden joins the Paris Accord, it's another victory for China. And if you watch what Xi Jinping said in Davos, he is all in favor of multinational efforts in organizations dominated by the Chinese. And I've watched for 3.5 years in Rome, as you would talk to people who are involved in these multinational organizations. The Chinese clearly had a strategy for gradually winning control of every one of them. And our State Department was too slow, too weak, too confused, and had been, by the way, for 3 or 4 presidencies, going back at least to Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and Obama. So while Trump was trying to turn it around and Pompeo was trying to turn it around, the Chinese have an enormous internal advantage in places like the World Health Organization or the World Food Organization, places where they've very methodically spent years gathering up a majority. So either you get a Chinese leader or you get a Chinese-approved puppet as the leader. And Xi Jinping was being very generous. By the way, the same week, they were flying military aircraft over Taiwan to send a signal to the United States and Taiwan that there were very strict limits to what the Chinese would tolerate. I don't know that the Biden administration had control of this yet. But at the same time, ironically, we sent a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier battle group into the South China Sea to directly contest China's claim to control that region. So there are a lot of things going on. Rasmussen had Biden at 48% approval, 45% disapproval. That would make him the weakest and least approved new president in modern history. Much weaker than Trump, who was, I think, at 56%, much weaker than Obama, who was, I believe, at 61%. I was actually startled when I saw that. And I think that that may be a consequence of the gap between his unity inaugural address and what he's been doing. And also the fact that when you go item by item, for example, a majority of the country was against rejoining the Paris Accords and believes it will kill jobs. A majority of the country was against killing the XL pipeline and believes it will kill jobs. So Biden has taken some fairly unacceptable positions for the average American. The last of which, of course, I want to mention is this whole decision that they will allow men, as long as you claim you feel more like a woman, you will be able to compete in women's sports, use women's locker rooms and the women's bathrooms. And there's no doubt, physiologically, that if you allow men to compete, they will gradually come to dominate almost every sport. You literally have, by executive order, functionally repealed Article 9, which created female sports in its modern form. So all of the progress of the last 30 or 40 years in creating well-financed opportunities for women to compete are now going to be, I think, directly threatened by an executive order signed on the very first day, which makes you wonder to what degree this will be a transgender-dominated administration, and what does that mean? And I think as the consequence of all this thing said that Biden will lose even more ground and that the Democrats' prospects for 2022 will get even worse. So that's a very sweeping overview of Biden's first week. I know what'll make you happy, getting your best credit score. The average American has 97 points they can add to their credit score. That's 97 points, but no idea how to get them. ScoreMaster knows how. ScoreMaster is not credit repair. It's credit science, and it helps you get your points fast. In fact, the average ScoreMaster user adds 61 points in 20 days or less. And getting your plus points fast can save you a fortune before you apply for a loan or credit card or refinance your home or buy a car. ScoreMaster is also great for business owners who use their credit score to finance their business. ScoreMaster is even great for mortgage brokers who need an edge and love getting their clients better deals. ScoreMaster is great for everyone. It even shows you the score consequences of spending too much or identity theft. No one else does what ScoreMaster does. Enroll in minutes and see how many points you can add to your credit score and how fast. Visit scoremaster.com/Newt. That's scoremaster.com/Newt.
If you sell stuff online, you're in the right business. With more people shopping online, chances are you're handling more orders than ever. That's why you need ShipStation. ShipStation makes managing and shipping orders so easy. Simply import orders from any sales channel, access discounted rates to ship with any carrier, and automate just about any shipping task. You'll spend a lot less time on shipping, so you can focus on growing your business. With ShipStation, you can manage all your orders in one interface from anywhere, even your phone. Ship with all major carriers, including USPS, FedEx, and UPS. And with access to discounts usually reserved for Fortune 500 companies, finding the best shipping solution for you and your customer is easy every time. Ship more in less time with ShipStation. Get a 60-day free trial with offer code PODCAST. That's 2 months free. Just go to ShipStation.com. Click on the microphone at the top of the page and type in podcast. That's ShipStation.com. Click on the microphone and type in podcast. ShipStation. Make ship happen.
Debbie, I think probably we ought to give people a chance to ask some questions.
Yeah, we have some great questions from our Inner Circle members. Our first question, Newt, can you explain HR 1? And Dr. Lowry from California asks, could HR 1 create a legal national mandate for mail-in ballots, ballot harvesting, and prevent any state from requiring a valid ID in order to vote? And wouldn't this be a death knell to democracy?
HR 1, this is a deliberate effort to create a federal mandate to make it easy to steal elections. There's no other way to say it, and I think we ought to be honest about that. The left is desperate to turn the whole country into California. They do not believe they can win honest elections. And if you look, for example, at the red states, even after everything that went on, you find states they're not going to be competitive in unless they can change the rules. So their answer is easy, change the rules. But the question was exactly right, and I think it's a huge problem.
Dave from Florida asks, should Liz Cheney be removed from her House Republican leadership position due to her vote for impeachment? And if we give money to the NRCC, how can we make sure that no money from our contribution goes to help Cheney or the 9 other House Republicans who voted for impeachment?
Well, I think you can earmark your money and just say that when you send it in. So that's not the big deal. I believe that any member of Congress has a right and, in fact, has a duty to vote their conscience. So I have no problem with Congresswoman Cheney voting any way she wants to. However, when she issued her statement, she should not have put her title, which is chair of the House Republican Conference, because that allowed the Democrats to then taunt the Republicans on the floor during the debate by reading her statement. And I think at a minimum, there ought to be a serious conversation in the House Republican Conference about leadership having an obligation, when it's going to split from the regular members, to do so in its own name and not do so using its title. Whether they want to go beyond that, certainly there's a faction that wants to strip her of her chairmanship. I think that's something they got to talk through among themselves. But at a minimum, they need to establish the precedent that members of leadership cannot take a position that is not representative of the members and use their title. They can take it as individuals. I really believe deeply that on issues of conscience, every member should vote their conscience and not vote some kind of party automatic vote.
Robert from Ohio was a phone team captain for you in Ohio during your 2012 presidential campaign. And he writes, now that we have Biden and the Democrats in power, we know that their climate change beliefs will be one of their main focuses. How can we use that focus to our advantage in advancing the space and Artemis programs? For example, convincing Biden and the Democrats to promote technologies such as nuclear fission, which can be used for space.
I think that it would be very helpful to have a Republican climate change agenda that was intelligent and that could compete head on. I agree with you, for example, that there are several things going on in space. One is both in the US and in China, there's a serious effort underway to develop solar power from satellites in space because you get 100% access to the sun 24 hours a day. Studies have been done. We're not that far from the technology coming down in cost to where you could actually deliver solar power by a form of microwave that would be very competitive and have no carbon footprint and none of the challenges we face with the current fossil fuels. I think also one of the great challenges for the green left is that nuclear power equipment clearly is dramatically better for the environment than virtually any other kind of energy. When you take the environmental cost of building wind power and building solar power, nuclear power is actually better because you have to use a lot of resources to build these so-called renewable fuels by putting together equipment that's not renewable, like the turbines on a wind tower. I would also say that the answer to most of the left on their dumber green ideas is two things. It is jobs and it's quality of life, cost of living. And on both of those counts, they tend to lose badly. And people, when they're faced with the real cost, tend to not be very comfortable going down that road.
Karen asks, how can this onslaught of shutting down free speech, the environment of cancel culture, and the destruction of the Republicans be turned around?
Well, I think, first of all, by standing up and saying no. Don't let yourself be bullied. Don't let yourself be intimidated. Second, there are emerging new technologies and new groups that don't have anti-conservative biases, and join one or more of those. Now, Parler ran into a problem because it was, in fact, a libertarian site that was open without censoring us, but it had been built around the big technology companies. And so they just strangled it. Now, whether or not it can get rebuilt, I'm not quite sure. We did a very, very interesting podcast with Amy Peikoff, the chief policy officer for Parler, and she did a good job of explaining where they were. But I think that there are emerging systems that have their own servers that don't rely on Google, they don't rely on Apple or Facebook or Twitter. And I think the more conservatives who go to them, the better off we are. Remember, it was the rise of Fox which changed the whole culture of the news media. I think similarly, the rise of one or two big competitive social media sites will have enormous impact. And of course, if you look at the stock market, Twitter is just taking a tremendous beating as people began to realize folks are just going to leave Twitter because it's so unreliable.
At Qualcomm, we believe in staying connected, and you can see us wherever 5G is helping transform telemedicine, supporting remote education, and powering mobile PCs. The invention age is here. Learn more at qualcomm.com/inventionage.
This is a great question from John in Wisconsin. If Vice President Harris is not a regular voting member of the Senate, just a tiebreaker, why does the majority leader shift to the Dems with a 50-50 split in the Senate?
That's a good question, but the answer is really simple. Because every time there's a tie, she'll break it. Therefore, functionally, the Democrats will always have the majority if they can get all 50 of their members. Now, apparently, there's a report out this morning that two of the Democrats have already said they will not vote to lift the filibuster. Snikma in Arizona and Manchin in West Virginia. If that's true, then the Democrats have a huge problem because that means on almost every major thing they want, they got to get 60 votes. I think that that would be an enormous game changer. I also think that there are a number of opportunities for Republicans in 2022 in the Senate. And if we pick up control once again, the Democrats will never have had a working ability to dominate the Senate. When Trent Lott and Tom Daschle had a tie Senate, had 50-50, with Dick Cheney breaking the tie under George W. Bush, they worked out a power sharing agreement because unless you work out some kind of power sharing agreement, since the Senate initially organized before the two Democrats from Georgia were sworn in, they organized as a Republican majority. So you have Republican chairmen of committees and no ability to defeat them because the committees are at best even money. So if you want to get to Democratic chairmen of the committees, you got to have some working relationship with McConnell and the Republicans. And so far, Schumer's not been able to figure out how to get to that because his left would regard power sharing as a defeat. On the other hand, it's a reality. They don't have 51. They got 50. And several of their 50 are very shaky, and very few of ours are shaky.
Jennifer wants to know, should we really be concerned with this talk of re-education of the children of Trump voters, as well as other threats made by the media figures, politicians, and businesses? Or do you think this is all hyperbole? It seems very unprecedented in America.
No, it's happening right now all over the place. I mean, if you look at the degree of left-wing indoctrination in the California schools or the Chicago schools or the New York schools, it's astonishing what children are being taught. The left wing figured out if they could dominate the college campuses through the professors, and then if they could dominate the public schools through the teachers union, they could gradually change all of America. And that's what they've been doing. It's a remarkable achievement on their part.
Dwayne from Minnesota would like for you to help us understand the history and the intended use of executive orders. He's having a hard time understanding why the increasing use of executive orders is tolerated or allowed to occur, and can executive orders be challenged in the same way a law could?
You can challenge executive orders and take them to court. And in fact, the Attorney General of Texas has filed a lawsuit against the executive order on suspending the agreement with Mexico about Mexico keeping the illegal immigrants on the Mexican side of the border. So you can legally challenge them. Executive orders originally were pretty benign. The question you've got is Congress passes a law. The president signs the law in. And now you have a question of exactly how are you going to implement the law? The original purpose of an executive order was to operate within an existing law and send an instruction to the bureaucracy about exactly how they should handle implementing the law. In the last two generations, it's become much broader and much wider. And as the Congress has deadlocked more and more, presidents both on the right and the left have used executive orders more and more aggressively. And that's where we are right now. It's partly a function of the collapse of Congress as an effective governing institution.
Dennis asks, if Mitch McConnell votes to convict Trump, do you think that that could destroy the Republican Party?
Oh, I think that if the Senate Republicans were to vote to convict Trump, they would guarantee the Democrats would stay in office at least through 2026. Biden would get reelected. The Democrats would keep the House and keep the Senate. A poll came out yesterday that if Trump ran as a third-party candidate, he would come in second and the Republican Party would come in third. My view is the arrogance and the corruption of members of the Senate and House deciding that they will take over the power to tell you who you are allowed to vote for. 74 million plus people voted for Donald Trump. Now, by what right does a Nancy Pelosi or a Chuck Schumer say that they can't be on the ballot and you can't vote for him? I think it's just crazy. And I think it's a total denial of the American people's right to pick who they want to vote for. To have the elites in Washington get into a habit of believing they can dictate to the rest of us who we're allowed to choose, I just think that's a terrible, terrible precedent. And I would think that when they think it through, I would hope that not a single Republican would vote yes once they thought through the historic implications. But it's not about whether or not he did something dumb on the 6th of January. It's about whether or not, as a consequence, and remember, you have lots of Democrats who incited lots of things, and you could find lots of people on the Democratic Party in the House and Senate that you could easily claim were far worse than Trump in terms of anything they said. You have no evidence that Trump was part of an effort to take over the Capitol, and increasing evidence that the FBI knew and warned that there were outside elements who wanted to come in and cause trouble. I just think this whole thing becomes very dangerous, not just for the Republicans, becomes dangerous for the nation, and I hope they'll back off from it.
Donald from South Carolina, who's a retired veteran and a minister, asks, I saw you Sunday on Mark Levin. How could I, one of the 74 million that voted for Trump, as peaceful patriot, get a list of the big tech, big companies, banks, and other organizations that are censoring people and politicians with beliefs like mine? He wants to get actively involved in a boycott. And do you know of any place that's publicizing this list?
I think that's a good idea, and we'll look into it and post it if we can find it. I think it is something the Republican National Committee ought to be producing. I mean, if Marriott Hotels announces they're not going to give any more money to Republicans, the RNC ought to lead an effort for no Republican to stay at Marriott. We've got to get to be as tough as our opponents who are trying to drive us out of public life. And we've got to be prepared. 74 million people is a lot of customers. And we could have a huge impact if we were organized.
Walter from Nevada needs your help explaining the election results to his 12-year-old daughter. He says, I know that people keep saying you got to move forward and not cry over the election results, but his daughter came to him and asked why it was okay for the left to break the rules and break laws related to the election, knowing that many of the courts didn't even review the evidence submitted. Then she asks, why do we cower in fear and accept the results? If it was a student council election that happened, that would not be allowed to take place. He would like help of what is a good response for her at 12 to help walk her through the situation and the bias.
Well, I think first of all, I just talk about the bias. It's true. You have the very large elements on the left. You certainly have the governor and the state legislature in Nevada. My advice to her would be, if she really wants to get into this, find a local state legislator who voted the wrong way, organize a campaign and beat them. And I think you'd be shocked how much impact that would have. And that is how in America historically these things change. And it often involves 12-year-olds who decide to get out there and decide that they're part of wanting to create a better future. And I think it'd be great if she got involved. Let me say to everybody, if you find it helpful to get the material, I try to report almost every day to the Inner Circle. It helps us when you write in and tell us what additional focus or what different focus you'd like to have. These are very, very useful get-togethers, and I pick up new ideas every time. And as you see things, we want your feedback. That's why this is called the Inner Circle, because we want you to feel, as a member of the Inner Circle, you can give us feedback. And candidly, to the degree you like doing this and you think it's useful, if you can encourage your friends to join, that's very, very helpful in enabling us to focus on public policy and continue to do the things that we think are important for America. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you to the members of my Inner Circle Club. You can learn more about the Inner Circle and sign up at newtsinnercircle.com. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.